and the centurion, and those who were with him guarding Jesus, seeing the earthquake and the things that had happened, were greatly afraid and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. On the day that Jesus died, his crucifixion not only washed away everything including our shortcomings and sins, but it also highlighted God's understanding, forgiveness, and healing. This is most clearly shown through the life of a Roman centurion who appointed Jesus to be crucified that day. The death of Jesus changed his entire perception, as well as brought his life to a completely new page. The warrior's name was Pontius Pilate. He was the 5th proconsul of Judea from AD 26 to AD 36 during the reign of Roman Emperor Tiberius. In the Bible, Luke mentions Pilate as a brutal manager. Luke 13:1 says, "Now there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices." Historical records describe Pilate as a harsh and at times cruel ruler who was willing to use force to force the Judeans to obey. However, many biblical texts show that Pilate was more sympathetic, even though he was the one who sentenced Jesus to death. According to the Gospels, the Sanhedrin arrested Jesus because they felt threatened by his teachings, claiming that he called himself King of the Jews, which was considered sinful, corrupt, and treason. According to the New Testament, at the insistence of the Jewish elders, Pilate finally gave in to the demands of the Jewish authorities and ordered Jesus to be crucified. It is said that at that time, Pilate washed his hands of the Jewish council, denying his responsibility and blaming the Jews. Soldiers brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate for trial, but Pilate was reluctant to condemn him. The Gospels also portray Pilate as quite conflicted and indecisive when judging Jesus' fate. This soldier was a war-hardened man, accustomed to brutality and death. However, something in the dark, that specific event, was about to change his life forever. His responsibility was to ensure that the execution would occur smoothly. He was accustomed to following rigid orders and maintaining order amid chaos. However, that day would be extraordinarily different from any he had ever experienced. This centurion, whose position demanded a cool and efficient character, was responsible for 100 soldiers. His rise in the ranks of the Roman army was due to his bravery, intelligence, and ability to handle extreme situations. Despite the events of that day, challenging that separation forced him to confront his own beliefs and emotions, an interpretation based on the common characteristics of the Roman centurions. As he watched Jesus being taken to crucifixion, the centurion could not ignore the dignity with which Jesus faced his impending death. He was accustomed to seeing men plead for their lives, curse their executioners, or succumb to despair. Yet Jesus maintained an awesome calm even while being tortured and ridiculed. That serenity began to plant a seed of doubt and curiosity in the centurion's heart, an interpretation based on Jesus' behavior described in the Bible. The crowd attending the crucifixion was in a frenzy, instigated by the religious leaders who wanted to see Jesus dead. For the centurion, that was just another day of work, another execution to keep the Roman peace. As events developed, he began to realize that there was something unique about that performance, something that defied his comprehension and began to stir his soul, an interpretation of the centurion's possible thoughts and feelings. It was his responsibility to ensure that the execution went smoothly. He commanded 100 soldiers, a man who rose in the ranks due to his bravery and intelligence. However, this day would be unlike any other. The task of overseeing crucifixions was for him a grim routine, but necessary to maintain the order and authority of the Roman Empire. The crucifixion of Jesus, however, began to stand out from all others he had witnessed. Jesus was taken to the praetorium, where the soldiers gathered around him, mocking and inflicting indescribable pain. They stripped him naked, put on a scarlet robe, and braided a crown of thorns on his head. Then they gave him a reed symbolizing a scepter and knelt before him in mockery, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spit on him and took the reed. The centurion, observing all this, could not help but notice the dignity of Jesus before so much humiliation. Any other man would have begged for mercy or cried out in pain, but Jesus remained silent, enduring the suffering with a calmness that defied human comprehension. This began to move the centurion, who, accustomed to brutality, was increasingly intrigued by that figure. When Jesus was finally taken to be crucified, the path along the Via Dolorosa was marked by the weight of the cross and by the compassion of a crowd divided between those who mourned and those who mourned and those who mocked. The women of Jerusalem wept for him, and he, amid his suffering, stopped to comfort them and for his children. The centurion watched all this with a mixture of disbelief and admiration, an interpretation based on the biblical narrative of Jesus and the women of Jerusalem. Despite being accustomed to executions, Jesus' crucifixion was not common. He had already executed many, but the tranquility and dignity of Jesus in the face of torture awakened something in him. The execution was carried out in Golgotha, the place of the skull, a place feared and known for its association with cruel death. The vision of Jesus carrying his cross there, accompanied by an involuntary spectator, Simon of Cyrene, was a scenario that was repeated with variations. However, Jesus' behavior was unprecedented. When they arrived at the place, they nailed Jesus to the cross and lifted it between two thieves, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy about him being counted among the transgressors. The crowd continued to mock him, and the religious leaders challenged him to come down from the cross if he was the Son of God. Even the crucified criminals at his side joined in the mockery. But Jesus remained silent, demonstrating an inner strength that confounded his executioners. The centurion, accustomed to the violent resistance and despair of the damned, saw in Jesus something completely different. His prayer to the Father asking forgiveness for those who crucified him resonated deeply in the soldier. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." These words, spoken amid agony, revealed a love and mercy that transcended human comprehension. The centurion began to question everything he knew about strength and power. As the hours passed, nature also began to react to Jesus' suffering. Darkness fell on the earth at noon, lasting until 3 p.m. This supernatural phenomenon increased the feeling of dread and reverence among those present. The centurion, watching the creation reacting so dramatically, was forced to recognize that something much bigger was happening. Jesus, even being mocked and beaten, remained composed. The centurion watched in shock at Jesus' dignity and silence, in contrast to previous executions. On the praetorium, soldiers stripped him naked, put on his clothes, and led him away to be crucified. They continued to mock him, but Jesus did not respond with anger or resistance. His silence was disturbing to those accustomed to seeing the despair of the damned. The centurion, witnessing this unusual calm, began to feel growing bewilderment. He had seen many men plead for their lives to their executioners or give themselves up to despair, but Jesus was different. He bore the pain with a peace that defied comprehension. That serenity was not the resignation of a defeated one, but the strength of someone who knew that his suffering had a greater purpose. Jesus' prayer for forgiveness for his executioners resounded in the mind of the centurion. He had never before heard anyone pray for his enemies of that kind. This demonstration of love and compassion contrasted sharply with the brutality of the act of crucifixion. The centurion began to wonder who this man was who could love so deeply even amid torture. As Jesus hung on the cross, he continued to demonstrate unusual concern for others. He entrusted the care of his mother to the beloved disciple John, showing a familial concern and a love that transcended the pain itself. Acts of compassion and care in the midst of suffering touched deep in the heart of the centurion, who saw in Jesus a humanity that defied his comprehension of strength and weakness. During the trial, the high priest challenged Jesus to declare himself the Son of God. Jesus firmly confirmed, causing a profound impact on the centurion who witnessed everything you have said. Jesus replied, "But I tell you, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Matthew 26:64. This statement was a turning point. The high priest tore his garments, accusing Jesus of blasphemy, which led to his condemnation. The centurion, present during this exchange, saw the calm and authority with which Jesus responded to the accusations. He did not defend himself or plead for mercy. Instead, he affirmed his divine identity, knowing that it would seal his fate. This behavior contrasted sharply with that of other condemned men, who often resorted to despair or denial. As Jesus was led back to the praetorium, the centurion may have reflected on what he had witnessed. Jesus' words might have resounded in his mind, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That vision of power and majesty contrasted with the scene of humiliation and suffering he was witnessing. How could anyone in such a situation speak with such certainty and authority? An interpretation of the centurion's possible reflections. As Jesus faced more humiliation and torture, his response remained constant. He did not curse his executioners or attempt to escape. Instead, he continued to demonstrate a calm strength that defied the centurion's comprehension. That strength was not physical but spiritual and could have begun to awaken a new perception in the hardened soldier. The crowd, incited by the religious leaders, demanded the crucifixion of Jesus. Pilate, yielding to the pressure, handed Jesus over to the soldiers. The centurion again saw Jesus calm amid the chaos. "Crucify him. Crucify him." The screams of the crowd resounded as Pilate washed his hands, symbolizing his attempt to absolve himself of guilt for the condemnation of an innocent man. Matthew 27:24. The centurion was accustomed to the violence and bloodlust of the crowds. He had seen many times the masses demand the death of the damned. Yet the intensity of the hatred directed at Jesus was unusual. He knew that the religious leaders were behind it, manipulating the crowd to ensure the execution of Jesus. That manipulation was not new, but the target of their manipulation. It was his hatred that disturbed the centurion. As Jesus carried his cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, falling under the weight, the centurion was forced to intervene by ordering Simon of Cyrene to help carry the cross. This simple act of compassion ordered by the centurion showed that even in his role as executioner, he was not insensitive to human suffering. He saw in Jesus a man who did not deserve that fate. As the procession progressed, the crowd continued to mock and insult Jesus. However, Jesus did not return the hatred. He remained silent, enduring everything with a dignity that defied expectations. That behavior contrasted with the typical reaction of other condemned, who frequently responded to violence with violence or despair. While Jesus was nailed to the cross, he did not express hatred or anger. On the contrary, he asked the Father to forgive those who crucified him, including the centurion himself. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. These words, spoken amid agony, revealed a depth of love and compassion that disarmed the centurion. The centurion, accustomed to hearing cries of pain and curses, might have been surprised by this prayer. Never before had he witnessed a man, especially one who was being so cruelly executed, ask forgiveness for his executioners. This demonstration of mercy may have begun to break the hardness of his heart, planting in him a seed of doubt about all that he had known and believed. While Jesus hung on the cross, he continued to demonstrate unusual concern for others. He entrusted the care of his mother to the beloved disciple John, showing a familial concern and a love that transcended one's pain. These acts of compassion and care amid suffering may have deeply touched the heart of the centurion, who saw in Jesus a humanity that defied his understanding of strength and weakness. As the crucifixion continued, the centurion observed the reactions of the crowd. Some other soldiers mocked Jesus, saying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Matthew 27:40. Others, however, may have begun to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake in condemning a righteous man. The centurion, seeing these divided reactions, may have felt a growing conviction that he was witnessing something divine. The soldiers, including the centurion, cast lots for Jesus' clothes. Even at that moment, Jesus' concern was with the forgiveness of his executioners, and when they had crucified him, they divided his garments by casting lots over them to see what each would take. Mark 15:24. This act of dividing the garments was common in Roman crucifixions, where the executioners were entitled to the condemned man's possessions. The centurion, observing this ritual, saw a striking contrast. While his comrades in arms were more concerned with Jesus' material possessions, he could not ignore the spiritual depth of what was happening. Jesus' words asking for forgiveness could still resonate in his mind, confronting him with a reality he had never considered. The Gospels relate that Jesus' garments were divided into 4 parts, one for each soldier. But his seamless tunic was drawn to decide who would wear it. "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Psalm 22:18. The centurion, although perhaps not knowing this prophecy, could begin to realize that everything that happened there had a deeper meaning. As the soldiers cast lots, Jesus continued to suffer in silence, displaying a resilience and serenity that defied human comprehension. For the centurion, every moment could increase his conviction that this was no ordinary man. He could have begun to reflect on the stories and miracles he had heard about Jesus, and how someone with so much power and compassion could be put to death. Suddenly the earth trembled, and a supernatural darkness covered the sky. These cosmic signs deeply moved the centurion, who had never witnessed anything like it from the 6th hour until the 9th hour. There was darkness over all the land. Matthew 27:45. This supernatural phenomenon increased the sense of dread and reverence among those present, making it clear that the crucifixion of Jesus was an extraordinary event. The centurion, who was already perplexed by Jesus' behavior, was now facing a nature that responded dramatically to the death of the man. The darkness at noon and the earthquake that followed were unmistakable signs that something beyond human comprehension was occurring. These physical events reflected the spiritual magnitude of what was happening. The darkness that lasted 3 hours could not be explained by a solar eclipse, for the Jewish Passover occurred during the full moon. Therefore, this supernatural event was perceived as a divine sign. The centurion, seeing creation react so dramatically, was forced to recognize that he was facing a unique moment in history. The earth shook, and the rocks split. Matthew 27:51. These events increased the centurion's conviction that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. The most sensitive nature in human hearts responded to Jesus' death. They were split, and the earth trembled, pointing out the importance of that moment. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Matthew 27:50. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Matthew 27:51. These physical events reflected the spiritual magnitude of what was occurring. The veil of the temple that separated the Holy of Holies was torn apart, symbolizing the new covenant between God and mankind through the sacrifice of Jesus. The centurion, seeing these signs, began to understand that Jesus' death was not just an execution, but a cosmic event of great spiritual significance. Darkness and the earthquake were physical manifestations of creation's mourning for the death of its creator. Spurgeon, a famous preacher, said, "He did not die for the rocks, yet the rocks were more tender than the hearts of men." The centurion, deeply moved by all these events, truly declared, "This was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. This confession was a powerful and sincere acknowledgement of the innocence and divinity of Jesus. The centurion, a man accustomed to the brutality of war and death, was deeply moved by what he saw and heard that day. His statement was a testament to the impact that Jesus' death had on him. The centurion's conviction did not arise only from external signs such as darkness and the earthquake. It was also the result of his careful observation of Jesus' behavior throughout the process of torture and crucifixion. He saw the dignity, compassion, and love of Jesus, even amid agony. This contrasted sharply with the brutality and cruelty he was accustomed to seeing in other executions. The centurion's proclamation was an act of courage and faith. Jesus had been condemned to death, but he still declared his belief in Jesus' divinity. This confession was a milestone in the centurion's life, a moment of transformation that led him to recognize the truth about who Jesus was. This statement was also a testimony to those who were present. The confession of a battle-hardened Roman soldier gave credibility to the divinity of Jesus. Jesus' death began to have an immediate impact, touching the heart of a man who was there to oversee his death. The centurion, who executed that day as an executioner, ended it as a believer. As the hours went by, the centurion may have reflected on the events. He may have thought of the meaning of Jesus' words and the impact of the events he witnessed. Jesus' prayer for forgiveness for his executioners, the supernatural signs, and Jesus' serenity in the face of death may have continued to resonate in his mind. Every moment of that day may have reinforced the conviction that he had witnessed something extraordinary. The centurion's possible reflections were full of questions. Who was this man he helped crucify? How could anyone endure so much pain and humiliation with such dignity? Why did nature respond so dramatically to his death? These questions may have begun to consume his thoughts, leading him to seek answers. Jesus' words to the high priest, affirming that he would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven, Matthew 26:64, could resonate in the centurion's mind. He could have begun to realize that the crucifixion was not the end, but the beginning of something much greater. The centurion, accustomed to dealing with death, might have begun to glimpse the promise of eternal life through Jesus. As he reflected, the centurion could also think of the responsibility he carried. He had overseen the execution of a righteous man, a man he now believed to be the Son of God. That weight of responsibility could have begun to transform his view of himself and the world around him. He was no longer just a Roman soldier, he was now someone who had been touched by divine truth. Something inside the centurion might have begun to change. He, a soldier hardened by war and death, might have felt his heart touched by Jesus' message of love and forgiveness. The brutality he had witnessed and participated in throughout his career now seemed empty and meaningless in the face of the compassion and mercy that Jesus demonstrated on the cross. The centurion could have begun to feel a new spiritual consciousness awakening within himself. He had seen many men die, but Jesus' death was different. There was a holiness and peace in the way Jesus faced his execution that was impossible to ignore. This experience could have begun to break the hardness of his heart, leading him to reconsider his beliefs and values. The centurion's inner transformation was not immediate but gradual. As he reflected on the events of that day, he could have begun to feel a growing need to seek the truth. He may have begun to wonder about the meaning of life and death and the purpose of his existence. This spiritual quest may have led him on a journey of discovery and self-knowledge. The centurion, who was once known for his efficiency and coolness, may have begun to demonstrate signs of compassion and humility. He may have gone on to treat his subordinates and prisoners with more humanity, reflecting the influence of Jesus in his life. The transformation of the centurion could have been a testimony to the power of the cross to change hearts and minds, leading him to a new understanding of love and justice. The impact of that day was not limited to the centurion. Other soldiers and bystanders were also deeply affected by what they saw and heard. Jesus' crucifixion left an indelible mark on all present, leading many to question their beliefs and seek the truth. Jesus' death began to scatter seeds of faith that germinated in the weeks and months that followed. Among those present were the women who accompanied Jesus from Galilee, including Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. They watched everything from afar, but their love and devotion to Jesus were undeniable. These women would be the first to witness Jesus' resurrection, and their testimony would be crucial in spreading the good news. The crucifixion also had a significant impact on Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both members of the Sanhedrin who secretly believed in Jesus. They risked their reputations and possibly their lives to ask for Jesus' body from Pilate and bury him with dignity. This act of courage and faith showed that Jesus' death was beginning to transform hearts even among religious leaders. The centurion, who began the day as an executioner, ended it as a believer. His declaration of faith was a milestone in salvation history, showing that even the most hardened can be touched by divine grace. The centurion's transformation served as a powerful testimony to the redemptive power of the cross, inspiring others to seek the truth and embrace faith in Jesus. Mary Magdalene, a devoted follower of Jesus, was present. Her testimony about Jesus' resurrection added more credibility to the centurion's experiences. She was the first to see Jesus resurrected, and her story inspired many to believe in the power of the resurrection. Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them what he had said to her, John 20:18. Mary Magdalene was a woman who had been delivered from 7 demons by Jesus. Her gratitude and love for him were deep, and she faithfully followed him, supporting his ministry. When Jesus was crucified, she stood at the foot of the cross, witnessing his suffering and death. Her constant presence at Jesus' side during his most difficult times showed her unwavering devotion. Jesus' resurrection was a moment of great joy and transformation for Mary Magdalene. She ran to tell the disciples, who were hiding out of fear of the Jewish leaders. Her message brought hope and renewed the faith of those who were discouraged. Mary Magdalene, as an eyewitness to the resurrection, was a powerful witness who helped spread the good news. The centurion, listening to the testimony of Mary Magdalene and other followers of Jesus, could have been further strengthened in his new faith. This profound understanding may have led him to share his own experience and faith with others. After hearing Mary Magdalene's testimony, the centurion may have begun to share his experience with others. He could have recounted how he had witnessed the extraordinary events at the crucifixion, including the supernatural signs and compassion of Jesus. His story could have touched many hearts and led many to faith in Christ. He could have become one of the first to publicly acknowledge the divinity of Jesus, showing that Jesus' message was for all, Jews and Gentiles. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus had a profound and lasting impact. The story of the centurion who began the day as an executioner and ended it as a believer is a powerful testimony to the transforming power of the cross. The message of Jesus continues to touch hearts and change lives just as it did more than 2,000 years ago. We may all be inspired by the faith and love of Jesus by following his example of compassion and mercy. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is the focal point of the Christian faith and possesses deep theological and spiritual significance. It represents the culmination of God's plan of salvation for humanity. To fully understand this importance, it is necessary to explore the dimensions of this event and how it connects to God's plan of salvation as revealed in the Scriptures. From the beginning of creation, humanity was designed to have an intimate and perfect relationship with God. Yet sin entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, breaking that fellowship and introducing death and suffering into the human experience. Genesis 3. Sin separated humanity from God, creating a barrier that could not be overcome by human actions alone. Jesus, as the Lamb of God, came into the world to atone for the sins of mankind.